Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do? Now that my master is taking the position away from me, I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning the master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in their dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The word of the Lord. The late spiritual and religious author and lecturer Phyllis Tickle wrote a popular article for pastors on this parable entitled, "Oh no, is it really time for the parable of the dishonest servant?" Which is how I felt this week. In that article, she called this story the most difficult parable of them all. Current pastor of Mount Olivet Lutheran Church in Minneapolis, David Lose, calls it the most confusing parable. And commentary after commentary expresses this uneasy feeling that we don't know exactly what Jesus is talking about in this parable. Late New Testament scholar and prominent Protestant theologian C.H. Dodd observed that even Luke seems a bit clueless as what to do with this parable, providing at least 3 interpretations for it by the time it ends. First, that the children of light should learn from the prudence of their corrupt neighbors. Second, that they ought to make friends by means of dishonest wealth. And third, that if one wishes to be entrusted with true riches, they must demonstrate honesty with ordinary wealth. So all of this is to say, if you are confused upon hearing this parable read this morning, then rest assured, you're in great company. Jesus tells us here about a manager that is about to lose his job because he has allegedly misspent his employer's assets. Because he doesn't think that he's cut out for a life of hard labor, and because he is too proud to beg, he goes to all the people who owe his employer money, and he reduces their debts. The author tells us that he does this so that the debtors may be hospitable to him after he loses his job. It is at this point in the story that he earns the title the dishonest manager, although many of us have convicted him since the very first sentence. But then, to our surprise, we're told that the employer commends the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. But we're left to wonder why. And why does Luke even include this story in his gospel? So let me just acknowledge from the outset that this story is complicated. And I am not sure if we can ever really understand all of the contextualities and complexities that are involved here. Although the author of Luke tells us that Jesus says this story to his disciples, we get the feeling that there are a lot of other people around. See, in the 3 parables that Jesus tells just prior to this one, we're told that there's a whole crowd of people listening to what Jesus says at this point, a crowd of people that contains Pharisees and scribes and tax collectors and sinners alike. And when this story ends, in the very next verse, verse 14, it says the Pharisees heard him say all of this to the disciples. So whether he only told it to the disciples or not, the author of Luke certainly gives us the impression that there are a lot of other people within earshot. Now, Jesus doesn't elaborate, but he does imply that the children of light lack something that the manager has. Perhaps it is his perceptiveness, his ability to assess the situation. Or maybe it is his desperation, and therefore his willingness to risk things that he would not have risked before that very moment. Perhaps it is his realization that he must use all that he has been given, his position, his power, maybe even his own profit, to achieve a better result. Or maybe it's his ability to all of the sudden be very clear on what is most important to him. We don't really know. And as much as that bothers me, I must admit, I kind of like this parable. If for no other reason than it is challenging. And I've never been one to pass up on a good challenge. It makes me want to search for other interpretive clues here. Greg Carey, professor of New Testament at Lancaster Theological Seminary, reminds his readers that this parable fits into the way that Luke writes, citing this author as having several parables like it, parables that he calls parables of crisis. Now, in this type of parable, characters of relatively high social status encounter a crisis. And in every instance, their help lies below them on the social ladder. For instance, in chapter 10, the anonymous Jew on the road to Jericho would have been superior to a Samaritan. But when he's lying half dead in a ditch, he will accept help from anyone who passes that way. And in the chapter just before this one, the prodigal son finds himself desperate enough to join the hired hands in slopping the pigs. And that same son who had no use for his father and all but wished him dead must ask his father for redemption. And the older son can't join the party until he reconciles himself to who he considers to be a scoundrel of a brother. And in the passage that immediately follows this one, we'll read about a rich man who ignores lowly Lazarus in this life, but in the next will beg for his help. In all of these parables, salvation lies in the hands of someone who would ordinarily have been readily dismissed by the character. Carey says these types of parables suggest that our belief in our status is not something we should bank on. In fact, relying on our status can be downright dangerous, which makes the fact that he says this parable to his disciples that much more interesting. None of us can afford to be complacent. And that seems to also be the case for the manager in our parable this morning. He once controlled all of his employer's debtors, the debts that they owed. He held their fate in his hands. But now his only hope seems to lie in the possibility that those same debtors might be hospitable to him and shelter him in their homes when he loses his job. Now, the word parable comes from a compound Greek word. Para, the first part, means to come alongside and compare. And balo, the second part of the word, means to throw. So parables are stories where concepts and ideas are thrown alongside one another in order to help us make meaning. There are definitely a lot of things thrown at us in this parable. So here's what I'm thinking. Jesus is speaking to his disciples, but he's also traveling in a crowd of people. His disciples, the Pharisees, tax collectors, scribes, sinners, they're all a part of this crowd. Jesus has been drawing them near to him ever since he's been traveling to Jerusalem, and everyone wants to hear from him. Each of them is banking that he's going to tell them something that they can do or be as the thing that will get them into the kingdom of God. Now, for some, that means living a life of religious faith strictly by the book, following all of the rules. They rely on history and tradition, and Jesus invites them to follow him. For others, it means believing they are forgiven. And then it seems okay, and Jesus invites them to follow him. Still, for others, it means that they must make amends. They must return the things that do not belong to them, and Jesus invites them to follow him. And then there are Jesus' own disciples, the people he invited first. And for them, they think they can just keep doing whatever it is they're doing because, after all, they're following in Jesus' footsteps, right? The point is, each person, each group listening to Jesus and following him is doing it for a reason and thinks that they might have a handle on what it will take for them to be able to enter God's kingdom. And Jesus let's all of us hear this parable, as if to say, not so fast. Just when you think you know where I'm going with all of this, God will surprise us all. Another professor of New Testament, this one from Luther Seminary, Matt Skinner, says that a parable gets its power from its ability to shock us into laying our revered values at the foot of the cross. I think he's right. But here's our problem. We all have different values. For some, the thing that is greatest value is money, is wealth. For others, it is status. For some, it's following all the rules. And for others, it's following all the right people. But for all of us, it's, can't you just tell us what to do already? And here's our other problem. We want Jesus to say the exact same thing to each and every one of us, because that's what we think would be fair. If we all had the same instruction, if we had the same boxes to check, if we had the same amount of treasure that we knew we had to store up, if we had the same level of spiritual achievement that we had to reach. But gosh, I mean, we live in this world and we know that's not very practical. So maybe the best thing Jesus can do is not give us all the same instruction, but tell us all the same story. Which got me thinking, maybe what Jesus is trying to accomplish here by telling this parable is getting us to let go of whatever it is we're banking on as being our ticket into God's kingdom, our values, and the things that we do and say and believe and pray and think will get us into God's kingdom won't. At least, not on their own merit. We must be willing to lay all of that down and give it up and go where Jesus goes and do what Jesus does and invite who Jesus invites and love who Jesus loves. And while all of this may seem very confusing indeed, the good news is that all of our lame and distorted assumptions about what God's kingdom will be like won't even come close to what God's reign is really like. It will surprise us. I'm banking on it. Amen.